I left it for the vegans.
Well, it's very good. I wasn't a vegan and I ate it. It's very good. Tasted very meaty. This is food.
Yeah.
Slump job doing it.
It's good to know ahead of time that you're gonna be on stools, right? You're not.
Margaret, thank you.
It's my first time doing one. I'm a little nervous about like questions and iterative stuff. So we'll probably miss it.
All right, we can go ahead and get started here. Thank you all so much for coming out today to our relaunch of the Unplugged series that ELI is running with Farella, Braun, and Martel. So I want to give a huge thank you to Farella, Braun for hosting this with us. Oh, I don't think.
Go in the middle, I can see you.
Oh, I can't see it. Or see my seat.
Yeah. Beautiful, work.
Okay, hello everyone. So as I was saying, big thank you to Farella, Braun for all of their help getting this program ready with us. I'm so appreciative of it. And thank you as well to our speakers. So we will have 2 virtual speakers today and 2 in-person speakers along with our moderator here. For folks online, we also have an audience in the room. Online folks, we will be taking questions throughout today's event, so please post your questions in the Q&A box on Zoom rather than the chat. The chat will also be open for you to post any observations throughout the program, but if you would like our speakers to address your questions, we'll need you to put it in the chat. For our in-person audience, please raise your hand if you have any questions throughout the program, and I will come around with a microphone. And with that, I will just hand things over to John Ugai, our moderator today, who's a senior associate at Farella, Braun, and Martel. Thank you so much, John.
Well, thank you, Madison, and thank you everybody for joining us in person and online today. We're really excited to welcome you to what is, as Madison mentioned, the reboot of the Unplugged series here. So this is one of many of a long-running panel series, and hopefully the first of many more. Today's panel is about sort of 2 emerging topics and sort of very trendy topics: environmental justice and the Inflation Reduction Act. And I know, all of you are very familiar with the Inflation Reduction Act, but we'll be calling it the IRA probably throughout the program, maybe IRA. We'll see how frisky we get. But today's panel, we're bringing together a group of experts to kind of talk about how these 2 topics interact. And there are 3 sort of main things we're hoping to talk about today. And one of them is just providing the context for environmental justice and clean energy and sort of why it matters and why it's important for our communities. And then talking about a couple of the different programs under IRA that are sort of aimed for environmental justice communities and whether or not and how they go about addressing those issues. And then they're just going to be talking a little bit about working with environmental justice communities and sort of the opportunities and benefits of engaging with them and how we can really sort of move forward. For me personally, this is a really important topic as we focus on we know that environmental communities have borne the brunt of some of the inequities in our racial and economic inequities in our society, and some of a lot of the environmental and health impacts of our current energy and industrial systems. And so the clean energy transition is an opportunity to address those. And so hopefully it's kind of some many discussions about how we can go about doing that in an equitable and effective way. And so I'd like to introduce, we have 4 panelists joining us today. We'll start with the folks joining us remotely. We have Miana Campbell, who is a policy analyst with the Office of Energy and Justice and Equity with the U.S. Department of Energy. So thank you, Miana, for being here. And then we also have Daniel Ramey joining us virtually. He is a fellow and director of the Equity and Energy Transition Initiative at Resources for the Future, and where he works on energy policy issues with a focus on the equitable transition. And just heads up, Daniel has to leave after the hour mark. So if you have questions for Daniel, get those in quick and we'll address them as we can. So thank you both for joining virtually. And then in person, first to my left, we have Tracy Craig, who is the principal and owner of Craig Communications. She's an expert in public participation and helps projects through the public approval process and works particularly with environmental justice communities in the Bay Area and around the country. And then we have Maria Campbell. She's a senior associate at the Rocky Mountain Institute. She's on the carbon-free electricity team. She also focuses on energy justice and environmental justice and energy affordability issues. And so just a big thank you for having our 4 panelists here today. I promise I'm almost done talking, but there's a little bit of table setting to go through the process. We first want to talk a little bit about what environmental justice means and what we mean by environmental justice communities, because they come in all different forms. There's lots of different names that are referred to them. I think if you look at the IRA, there's sometimes disadvantaged communities, sometimes communities of color. And so I'd like to kind of ask each of our panelists just if they have an example that comes to mind when they think about an environmental justice community. And I think they'll help us give a flavor of the diversity of the communities that we're talking about here today. And so maybe I'll start with you, Tracy, since you're right here.
Okay, let me see, do I have this working right? Is that working? Doesn't sound like it. No, it's working.
Yeah, sounds good.
You're here, okay. What's interesting, when we were prepping for this, I think we talked about it, and every community is different, right? Like all of you live in a community and every single one of them is different. I work a lot in the Bay Area and I work a lot in West and East Oakland. And I think West Oakland is probably one of the best examples for me of a community that's been suffering from injustices due to siting of the port, a big freeway running right through it. The community was cut in half. And when they were building the freeway, and so they completely separated the community, thinking it wasn't really a community. And they've had a disproportionate share of health impacts as a result. In fact, I think everybody knows the zip code kind of thing, where the people that live in West Oakland have a 5 to 8 year difference in lifespan than people that live up in the hills in the Bay Area. And so I think that's probably a very, very good example of communities that deserve more attention and certainly more justice.
Yeah, I mean, very well said. Thank you, Tracy. Maria, what about you?
Yeah, there's a reframing of this definition from a professor from CCNY that I really liked. And she says, instead of saying historically marginalized communities, let's say intentionally segregated, underserved, and disenfranchised communities. And when you think about those words apply pretty perfectly to the energy system as well. Because when we think about what that looks like in practice, for example, I work in the electricity sector. When you think about the communities that live near a coal plant, we know that they're seen as less than, and that, as you mentioned, they're going to be at the forefront of those health impacts. So thinking about the history in terms of things that are actively happened and not just passively happened to communities is really important. And yeah, so thinking about that history and how that shapes the energy system today of inequity, but then also thinking about the harms that they're facing today and that they're paying for, literally in like high energy bills and medical bills, but also just in general quality of life.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a good point. When I first took environmental justice in college, we talked about it as like where you live, eat, and play. And it's just, the issues can be so encompassing and touch every part of your life, right? And so it's important, I think, not to think about it just in the context of like the environmental impacts as we as often do, especially me as an environmental attorney, often about like, oh, what are we polluting? But there's so many more impacts associated with it. Diana, I'd love to hear your perspective on this.
Yeah, it's probably no surprise coming from the Department of Energy, sitting in the Office of Energy Justice and Equity, that I'm going to focus my answer on energy, and maybe more of a positive light on it. So when I think of environmental justice or tied to my work in general, energy justice, what I'm thinking about is how we're actively attempting to reimagine the energy systems, and not just kind of looking at it of like, how can we move forward, but thinking about the whole process from, the tenets of procedural justice, distributed justice, kind of the whole, what's it called, restorative justice pipeline, and what we can do to really change and bring the communities along with us.
That's a great, I love how you tied in restorative justice to it. I think that's often, I've always heard about that in the context of personal, interpersonal conflict, right? But I think it applies to the community as a whole. And so, I really appreciate that perspective. Daniel, what are your thoughts on this?
I've been thinking about how much variation there is, as Tracy said, and I've been thinking about how it's not really possible to define what is or is not an environmental justice community. There's not like a bright line that you can draw. There are lots of metrics you can use to inform your decision, but it's quite difficult. And there's also a wide range of perspectives from within these communities about whether or not people perceive themselves to be living in an EJ community. If you go to, parts of southern Louisiana, or you go to, the River Rouge neighborhood in Detroit, near where I live in Ann Arbor, there have been decades of buyouts of people, lots of evidence of disproportionate environmental burdens. And these people are very aware of the disproportional environmental burdens that they bear. But if you go to other parts of the country that are major oil and gas producers, or even if you go to Campbell County, Wyoming, right, by far the largest coal producing region of the United States, and you ask people, are you an environmental justice community? Are you suffering from environmental justice burdens? I think many of them will probably look at you like you're a little crazy. The lenses that people bring to this really varies a lot from place to place. And I should say that most of my perspective on this topic is from fossil fuel producing communities, where I do lots of research.
Yeah, no, that's a great perspective. And I think to think about the rural communities is really important. I grew up in a small town in Colorado. That was an old mining town. And so I didn't really think about it as like an extraction zone until I started thinking about the historical impacts. And it was actually the town where there was an old mining plug that broke and the river turned orange. It's like 5 years ago, but that was my hometown. And so you don't even necessarily know about what the historical impacts are in your community if there hasn't been like the education around it. Maria, I'd love to ask you, so with that context of who we're talking about in terms of environmental justice communities, why are clean energy projects so important for these communities?
Thanks for teeing that up. So, environmental justice communities, given that they have this history, they deserve better. They deserve cleaner air, better wages, better quality of life. And especially with the recent IRA incentives that really center, labor standards, and it's mostly for clean energy that we know is better from a greenhouse gas perspective, but also a local pollutant perspective. Clean energy really brings really substantial health and economic benefits that we know can go down to employment opportunities. And that's something that RMI, we've really done a lot of thinking about what's the fastest way we can get clean energy deployed. And we actually found that there's a 250 gigawatt opportunity for building clean energy with it close to existing fossil sites, because we know the faster the clean energy can get online, the faster that these communities will have access to clean energy, which we know is lower energy bills and better air to breathe in. So really centering those health and economic benefits that we know comes with clean energy.
No, exactly. I think the hitting on both the economic and health benefits are really important, and their reliability, and thinking about too often these communities have a lack of access to green space, right? And so we're with warming climates, there's increased impact with reliability issues and heat effects, right? And so I think it's all just so important. I'd love to talk a little bit about the IRA now. The two programs we're going to focus on are the low-income communities bonus credit and the energy community tax credit bonus. But so first, I'd like to ask Mayana a little bit if she could kind of walk us through what the low-income community bonus credit program is.
Yeah, absolutely. I do have a bit of a disclaimer jumping into this. So I'm presenting this information just so everyone knows as part of my role at the Department of Energy, Office of Energy Justice and Equity. So what I am presenting today is not representing the 48E program, the IRS, nor Treasury. And the information I share in this panel, it should not be derived from any intimate knowledge of the program. So everything I'll talk about is public information today, but do have to give that disclaimer going into it. So to jump into the program that was specifically asked about, the low-income community bonus credit program is established under Section 48E of the IRA, developed by the Department of Treasury and the IRS, and it's administered by my office, the Department of Energy's Office of Energy Justice and Equity. And it aims to promote clean energy investments in historically marginalized communities. So essentially what it is qualified solar and wind energy facilities with a maximum net output of less than 5 megawatts can receive a 10 or 20 percentage point increase in the investment tax credit. The program allocates up to 1.8 gigawatts of eligible solar and wind capacity per year, with a credit increase based on factors such as installation location and project type. So that kind of gives you a brief overview of what the program is. And in exciting news, we launched, I think, program year 23 in October or November of last year. There is a public dashboard up, so you can see how those awards are going, which is amazing. And then a few weeks ago, Treasury released the 2024 revenue procedure, and also announced that program year 24 will open in Q2 of this year, which we are in. So kind of an exciting time to be chatting about this.
No, it's great. The recent news about sort of the interest in the program has been really encouraging. I'd love to hear a little bit too about, like, if we were in 10, 15 years from now, what kind of impacts would you like to see to know that to consider the program successful in your mind? Like, what would it mean on the ground for environmental justice communities?
Yeah, so the program has 3 goals, which everything is rooted in these program priorities. So every action we take, every update, every award we make, they are as follows, kind of top line headers: increase, encourage, and provide. So we are hoping to increase the adoption and access of renewable energy facilities in low-income communities, encourage new market participants in the clean energy economy, and provide social and economic benefits to those in those communities. So essentially, kind of going back to that energy justice landscape that I provided early on, we are looking to achieve equity in both social, economic, and health burdens on historically harmed communities by energy systems. So a lot of these communities have been powering America for a century, right? And we want to make sure that they're part of this transition. They've been holding a lot of the burden of the energy sector. So all of our policy demands and all of our updates are underpinned by the rights to healthy, sustainable energy production, quality infrastructure, and affordable energy service.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. And then, so the second program we're going to talk a little bit about is the energy community tax credit bonus program. And so, Daniel, I was hoping you could give us kind of a overview, 300,000-foot view of the program.
Sure. So this is a 10% additional tax credit that certain clean energy projects are eligible to receive if located within what is defined as energy communities in the Inflation Reduction Act. The way that energy communities is defined is somewhat technical, but I'll try to do it quickly. an energy community is a statistical area, a metropolitan statistical area, where there is 0.17% or more of local employment tied to fossil fuels. That's actually kind of weird because 0.17% is well below the national average of fossil fuel employment, and that has implications for which parts of the country are eligible. In addition to having above 0.17% of employment in fossil fuels, the statistical area also has to have above average unemployment relative to the previous national average in the previous year. So that's one way to qualify. A second way to qualify is if the project is on a brownfield site. That one's pretty straightforward. The third way to qualify is if the census tract where the project is located has either a coal-fired power plant where a coal-fired generator has closed or a coal mine has shuttered in the last few decades. So those are the three ways you can qualify to be an energy community. And when you actually look at the map for which parts of the country do qualify, it's a large part of the country. And that's largely because of that 0.17% threshold that I mentioned earlier. I don't know the exact percentage, but it's probably more than a third of total US land mass is defined as an energy community under the IRA.
Yeah, so RFF did a report on this. And so you can, if you go to Daniel's bio, I think the report's linked, but it has the maps and it's like pretty staggering how much of the country is covered. And what I think is sneaky about it is, I don't know, when I first heard of the program, I just assumed it was like, oh, energy community, environmental justice community, probably the same thing, but it's really, there's a lot of nuance there, I think, as Daniel's describing. And I love, Daniel, if you just kind of talk about like, how does that definition of the energy community map on to like the communities that we think of as environmental justice communities?
Yeah, I mean, there's some overlap in the Venn diagram, but it's definitely not complete. You know, I think the intent of the program, right, is to steer investment towards fossil fuel dependent communities, because as we transition towards a clean energy system, you know, tax revenues and jobs from the fossil fuel sector are likely to decrease. Federal government's aware of that, and so they're trying to sort of give a boost to those communities so they have alternative employment opportunities, alternative tax bases, and economic activity. Again, some of those places probably consider themselves to be EJ communities, or I should say individuals living in those places would consider themselves to be members of an EJ community. But again, some of them probably don't. The sort of end result of the broad definition of the law, you know, from my perspective, when I did the analysis on this, you know, it seems to me that because we're covering so much of the United States as an energy community, we're really not targeting the places that are likely to be most directly affected and most negatively impacted by a transition towards clean energy. And so I think, you know, in a perfect world, you might refine the definition of energy communities a little bit to try to be a little bit more precise and really target the benefit to where it's most needed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that's 100% true. In Daniel's report, they sort of provide some alternative criteria that you could consider. Maria, I'd love for you to talk about how this program interacts with other IRA incentives, and maybe potentially, I think you started to touch on clean repowering, but maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, RMI found a 50 gigawatt opportunity for building clean energy in this faster way by leveraging existing interconnection sites. And the energy community tax credit really bolsters that, since I think, a good chunk of those areas already have that adder or could qualify for that adder if the fossil site is slated for retirement. But I wanted to piggyback on something that Daniel said about that Venn diagram and where there is overlap. So I'm from South Texas, work closely with majority Latino communities in South Texas, and they, where I'm from in the border town called Laredo, literally qualifies for all three criteria of like retired coal sites, brownfields, since we know there's a legacy of environmental justice tied with that, as well of where there is landfills and things like that, and then also fossil employment, since there's a lot of natural gas production. So I think there's a good opportunity for when there is investments directed to energy communities, as Daniel said, you know, thinking about who they are and what they want and how the histories could bolster the opportunity there. So that's something that we really thought about with clean repowering as well, saying, yeah, tying those benefits of bringing new clean energy on.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's such a tangible opportunity in the sense of like, you're really taking old, like, you know, if you're in the place of like a coal plant, you're like a dirty, you know, polluter in the community and potentially turning it into something that's positive. And so I think it's kind of a very clean example and really helpful to think about like what are the potential benefits of the community with this. And I think that leads us kind of in the next sort of topic that we want to talk about today, which is a little bit just like how this all interacts, what it means to like work with environmental justice communities, what and like where like and how they can benefit sort of both developers and the communities at the same time. And so Tracy, I'd love to ask you, and sort of based on your experience, you know, working through different public participation processes, like how has involving communities early on in the process benefited both the developers and the project?
So if you hear anything today, this is what you need to hear about community involvement. It is absolutely critical to projects that you involve communities early and you involve them often. And I know that's a lot of that can be very uncomfortable for people, right? Because a lot of times you're working with folks that might be angry, might be hard to work with in the beginning. And when people are usually angry when they feel they haven't been heard. And that's just a natural reaction. I think everybody can probably think to a time when you were with your mate or your partner or your kids and you started ratcheting up things and you keep talking louder and louder and you're frustrated because you can't be heard. So involving people early is just a basic right? People have the right to know what's going on in their community and to have input into that. It's also expected, at least in California, you are not going to get any project done unless you involve the community. It's that simple now. And I know that the rest of this, I don't work nationwide, but I know that there's a lot of people following suit nationwide. And so California's been leading a very strong movement to involve the community in meaningful ways. And that's more than just telling people, deciding, announcing, and defending is what we used to call it, the DAD model. So now it's actually having real conversations that can facilitate better and more sustainable project decisions. It's uncomfortable to do. The public process is a messy one, but in the end, I can think of several projects I've worked on where we have wonderful, wonderful outcomes because we involve the community and they came up with better ideas that we would have never thought of. One of those is that we put solar panels on the top of a logistics facility and the solar was sold back to the local electrical provider and that money went into the community for community benefits. And it's ongoing, right? So it's not just a one and done, it's a continual pot of money. And I personally would have never thought of that. And that was community we're thinking of that.
Oh, that's such a great example. And that kind of piggybacks, I think, to something that we talked a little about, Maria, when we were prepping, and then the idea of like community benefit agreements. And so I would just love you to kind of talk us through that a little bit and how like you can use that to both facilitate participation in the environmental justice community and like sort of help gain support for projects.
Sure. Yeah, before I get to community benefit plans and agreements, love to piggyback on something that Tracy said, which is when you bring in the community, I think there's been a really great trend of local organizations coalescing around the concept of energy democracy. And this ties into something that Mayanna said well, of procedural justice, making sure that everyone is at the table and can be heard. And a recent group that I worked with in South Texas, they're actually knocking on doors and telling people, do you know who your electric provider is? Do you know that they have semi-annual meetings? So I think energy democracy is also this concept that really has been good on the ground for getting people involved, for organizations that are asking for things. So that's something that I think is relevant to this conversation as well. But in terms of actual tools that are already happening to make sure that environmental justice communities have actual mechanisms that they can enforce with the developers that are coming in their community, there are things known as community benefit agreements and community benefit plans. So one is legally enforceable. I think that's a community benefit agreement. And then a community benefit plan is not, but it's something that a community works together with a developer to say, if you're going to create a project here, these are the investments that we want you to make. This is a timeline for those investments, and those things can look like investments in affordable housing, worker protections, financial contributions to a scholarship fund, or other philanthropies in the community. And of course, that's not going to solve all the issues that a community has, but it could be something that could be used to abate or at least address current inequities rather than exacerbating them. Because something we've heard at RMI is that a lot of communities that are being considered for renewable energy development are worried about the same extractive processes that have happened with fossil development just reoccurring, even though it's for clean energy now. And we definitely don't want that extractiveness to be replicated in the energy transition.
No, I think that's so important. And this is just the idea, or I guess the concept of thinking about like what are the benefits to the community and working with community is a really rich topic. So I'd love Mayanna or Daniel, do you want to chime in on this at all, or anything to add to what Maria and Tracy just said?
I was waiting to see if you go off mute. I actually lost track of the question, if I'm being completely honest, of what was being asked. But in terms of what I was hearing, I think there is always a fear of, energy. The energy sector is just rife with problems historically, right? And there is a fear of the same thing happening again. So I do want to echo that. And I also want to echo what Tracy said of like, if you take one thing away, it is involving the communities. These projects, and especially the things that I'm seeing and working on, they are community-based, right? You're using the community land, you're providing community energy, you're providing energy in particular neighborhoods that haven't always seen the follow through and might not have the trust that these programs are good programs. So it's just following through and making sure that that community knows what's happening, and they are part of designing it and really making something that fits that community instead of just coming in and creating kind of that same thing replicated state after state, county after county.
Yeah, and I would just build on that to say something that might sound a little on the edge, which is that like just because you're building a clean energy project in an EJ community doesn't mean you're benefiting the community. The jobs for construction might go to people who live outside the community. The pollution reduction that occurs might not happen in your community. If you live near an oil refinery, building a solar farm isn't going to do anything for you. And so it's important to keep those sort of realistic perspectives in mind as we talk about these, very ambitious and worthy and challenging goals.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point, because it's, when we talk about overburning communities, it's often not because there's one thing in the community, right? Like there's a whole sort of mix of sources and issues that the community is dealing with. I also think when people start to think about projects in the community or think about like communities that have environmental justice issues, it's often seen as like something kind of scary, or public participation is often seen as like a potential delay or something that is gonna, sort of, I don't want to derail a project, maybe a little harsh, but I think there are a lot of misconceptions around that. And Tracy started talking about this a little bit when you're talking about the benefits of working with environmental justice communities, but if you had to sort of identify some of the misconceptions or myths about working with environmental justice communities, like what are some that come to mind?
I think the first, sorry about that. I think the first one is that it has to be a horrible process, but you have to do it, right? You have to do this so to get my project through. And I will say, first of all, just in timing, if you involve a community early on in the process, you'll realize project and schedule and cost efficiencies on the back end. If you don't, and you get sidetracked by the community and they're up in arms, your project schedule goes out the window. And I've worked on projects where that's happened. And it's really hard to reel a project back in when you have an established trust. So just a couple things I want to say. I just want to get this out there. Because we were talking about partnering really with community organizations. And I think that's one of the best ways that you can go into a community. One, study study your community, figure out who's who are the decision makers, who are influencers, who holds some power in the community, what organizations are important, faith-based, job policy groups. There's all kinds. Figure that out and then go meet with people and listen. Don't go in there, I've got this project, I want to tell you about it. Go in there and have listening sessions and figure out who you can really partner with to move your project forward and develop trust in the community. And if you do that on the front end, then you'll have an easier way on the back end because people will be supporting your project and you start gaining support throughout. So I wanted to get that out and now I forgot what the question is. So what was it again? I got out what I needed to say.
And that was even more relevant. The question was just to kind of talk about maybe like what are some misconceptions or myths about working with environmental justice communities, which I think you hit on a lot in what you said.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I just think the other one is that you can't come to a consensus. You're not going to be able to work with people. It's going to be a messy, ugly process. And it's uncomfortable, right? And it doesn't have to be uncomfortable. Like I approach my work still after 35 years with curiosity. I go into communities being curious and really wanting to know what would make this okay with you. And to the point that was earlier, that a lot of things that are coming into communities, there's not going to be that many jobs. You're actually taking away jobs. So you need to figure out ways to balance that. And maybe that's working with the local job center so people get training on the construction portion and then they can play that forward. There's all kinds of things that you can do, but in order to do that, you have to have conversations with people. You can't do it in a vacuum.
That's so great. And I think too, like we said, communities are so diverse. So I think there's a big difference depending on what communities you're working with. And Daniel, I know you talked a little bit about your work, both with fossil fuel communities, but also studying an energy transition on reservations where there's like a huge amount of interest in clean energy. Well, depending on, I think it's from what I understand, very diverse perspectives amongst tribes about how they feel about energy generation. So I shouldn't say there's like huge interest, but I know certain nations like the Navajo Nation is looking at those opportunities. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about like, just kind of demystify that little process and talk about the complexities there are for the energy transition for those communities.
Sure. I'll do my best, right? There's more than 500 federally recognized tribes in the United States and in Alaska. There are Alaska Native corporations. There are so many different actors. And then, of course, within any Native nation, there are lots of different opinions, like any other community, right? People have different views, just like Tracy is saying. It's not a consensus kind of situation. But one of the issues that I've worked on recently in partnership with a couple of tribes out west is like, how are they thinking about their economic futures in a world where oil and gas production, which is a major source of revenue for a couple of tribes, in a world where that revenue goes down. And in the past, there have been lots of barriers to tribes being able to exercise their sovereignty and to the federal government holding up its end of the bargain in terms of its federal trust responsibilities. In the last, I would say, couple of years, there's been renewed interest in renewable energy development on reservation land, largely driven by indigenous activists who are trying to get solar, in particular, deployed at community scale and residential scale across lots of reservations. But there are also helpful changes in the tax code in the Inflation Reduction Act. There's the so-called direct pay provision where tribes and other other entities that are not subject to income taxes from the federal government are now eligible to receive clean energy tax credits where they essentially weren't before. There's some other changes around transferability of these tax credits that makes it easier for Native nations to participate. And so, there is this growth of renewable energy development happening on lots of reservations. But at the same time, there are some, Native nations that are actually very supportive of continued fossil fuel production. The best example of this that comes to mind is the Dakota Access Pipeline, which everybody knows about because of the protests on the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation and how it united many tribes. But most people don't know that like a large portion of the oil that goes through that pipeline comes from a reservation in North Dakota, a couple hundred miles away from the Fort Berthold Reservation, where the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara nations are located. So that's all just to say, like, this is complicated stuff, and we shouldn't homogenize across any community, and that includes across tribal nations and native nations.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. And it like kind of piggybacks off what we're talking about, the diversity of environmental justice communities. And I think it also touches on some of the deeply complex, like in economic issues, in particular where communities are reliant on the fossil fuel industry for jobs and things like that. And so maybe Maria, you could talk a little bit about sort of how to balance that transition when you're thinking about like a community that is economically reliable on some of the industries that are also having a negative impact on that same community.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that South Texas majority Latino community that we recently worked with to identify clean energy opportunities in like the Rio Grande Valley area. So as we've all said, yeah, environmental justice communities are really diverse. And this community just started organizing around the topic of energy democracy and climate justice a few years ago. So luckily, we were commissioned by this project with this community that kind of already has awareness and, you know, are centered around these organizing principles of climate justice and energy democracy. And when we talk to them about, you know, how can we sell these clean energy opportunities that we're going to identify to the community so that you can campaign around them, noting that it's Texas, there's so much natural gas employment there when we looked at it. They said, as Tracy said, you know, think about the local context. And they were like, so much nearshoring has happened here where so many manufacturing jobs have gone to Mexico. And the one thing that we can really organize people around are good paying jobs that'll stay here. And as we've talked about, you know, the IRA really does center the workforce piece. So they're like, if you can talk to us about the clean energy capacity, but then the associated job and economic development opportunities, then that'll help contextualize this in a very like pro-fossil community, because as we said, there's so many things going on and that community has felt that legacy of inequity and job loss. So kind of thinking about all the dimensions and other phenomena that's going on was really helpful. And luckily they've done organizing and kind of were able to name that pretty upfront. So
yeah, but you're right. That's such a good point about the IRA. It's so like labor focused, and I mean, it is like a tax credit program, and the ones that we're talking about now. So it is like very economically driven, as opposed to like, you know, you could have like a mandate or something, or like the clean energy targets that a lot of states have. Diane, I'd love to hear if you could talk a little bit more about like what are the sort of intended economic benefits for communities, kind of under, I mean, to the extent you're willing to talk about things in the IRA, I may just caveat that, but yeah, your perspective would be great here.
Yeah, I don't think I have a place to talk about that holistically, right? But what I can say is this is a partnership between public and private and communities, and it's a really unique way to drive investments. So we are asking for companies and rewarding them for investing in areas and bringing communities up that we're identifying as communities that could use investments and have been historically overlooked, or have helped us power our nation for a century. And, you know, they should be part of that transition with us. So I don't think I can necessarily talk about it to the depth that you're hoping, but we're seeing obviously excitement in the market. I mean, just look at what the EPA released over the last few weeks. We're talking billions of dollars that went out to some nonprofits, to states directly to develop programs. And what's really cool when you start looking at it from that perspective is the states really know what their communities, their residents need. So they get to define and self-create, right? Instead of being mandated and told, which is amazing.
Yeah, I think that like perspective of empowering the community is really important when you're talking about environmental justice communities and folks who have like their political voices been marginalized for a lot of, you know, our history as a country, and so that's such a key perspective. So I have like one more maybe written question before we open it up, which is just like a primer to start, you know, sending questions into the chat or kind of brainstorming for the folks here in person. But I would love to kind of ask you all about. When I think of climate change, I think of like the impending doom and the clock that's ticking on us, and all the science reports that say like we need to have started to make efforts yesterday. And so there's always this tension with like, how do you move quickly? And how do you move responsibly, right? And so I'd love to kind of hear your all's perspective about like, how do you weigh that tension of needing to do big things quickly with also not wanting to repeat the mistakes of the past or to do so at the expense of sort of leveraging communities that we've put the cost on it before historically. And that's a big question. So I'm gonna see who like, all right, Marie, you laugh. So I feel like that volunteers you to do the first one. Sorry.
Yeah, so I graduated high school in 2017. So I was in college during the Trump era when there was, you know, a lot of cynicism and things like that. And luckily now that I graduated, it was into the Biden administration where there was a lot of opportunities. So I've kind of gone from like the doomer to, you know, we can actually act now. But what I think of when you ask that is you feel so much hope when you talk to people. Like as someone who is spending time on Python modeling for like 80% of my day and just like emissions are still going up, things like that. But then when you're thinking about how to actually try to get emissions going down on the ground, I feel so much hope when I'm talking to community organizers that are going door to door and trying to really get people mobilized about the issues in their community. So, you know, trying to balance that realism of, you know, the targets that we need to hit and things like that, but really just finding the hope in the people, because the people on the are the ones that are actually going to make this happen. So never losing that thread of, you know, trying to be grounded, but then also finding hope that, as we said, people are smart, people can know what they want if you meet them at the table. So yeah, that's kind of how I balance it.
Yeah, that's great. I appreciate the positivity. You know, I think that's sometimes missing a little bit in the existential dread that I think lots of people feel. Not speaking from experience or anything. Daniel, I love, yeah, I see you kind of raising your hand there. Please chime in.
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's one that I actually thought about a lot. So I think you're right that there is a tension between decarbonizing quickly and decarbonizing equitably. You could imagine a sort of omnipotent government coming in and paving over certain communities and building solar and building wind in places where people didn't want it, and building CCS and nuclear in places where people didn't want it. And, you know, that might get you more quickly to your end state climate goal. The work that I think, you know, many of the folks on the panel here are doing, it's all about how do we decarbonize equitably. And I think we need to recognize that in some cases that means moving slower on certain projects. And the way that I sort of resolve that tension in my head is that equity issues, just like climate change, it's not like a black and white thing. There's not like a point at which, like, despite the focus on 1.5 and 2 degrees, like those are essentially arbitrary targets. The like going over by 1/10 of a degree or going under by 1/10 of a degree does not guarantee anything in the physical climate system. And so like every 1/10 of a degree matters in terms of emissions reduction, and every sort of equity outcome matters in terms of trying to improve them as much as we can as we seek to decarbonize at the same time. And we have to like take wins when we get them and accept losses when they happen. So that's how I think about it.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's there's a lot more gray in life. Yeah, I feel like as you sort of dive into things, like you realize there's very few like all or nothing things, and that's such a good perspective. All right, well, I didn't go to law school to like not fight my own hypothetical. So Tracy, I love to hear you just push back on this idea that public participation is going to slow it down. I mean, is that your experience or your way that involving?
Well, I think I'll say that, you know, we're talking about communities, right? But really we're talking about people working with people at the end of the day. And so in my particular practice, I take my projects and I do the absolute best we can to involve the community, come up with sustainable solutions and move the projects forward. And I feel that if you show up People want to be seen, they want to be heard, they want to know they matter, they want agency over their lives. That's pretty much what everybody wants, right? And so if you can give that to folks that you're working with on the ground, then projects do move forward. And I think that we can make a model that looks good and works, and then that's scalable to other communities. Because otherwise, I don't think we're going to be able to do this, right? Because it does take a lot of time. But I'll just end with this. I'll say it again. If you do work in the beginning, it's going to streamline the back end of the project, so much so that it's almost unbelievable. And so I would say, hold on to that. Try to make a scalable model that is replicable to the extent it can be to other projects. And then to Daniel's point, this is like a sea change involving the community in a real way. So if you're really going to do that and mean it, it is going to take some time, but it will actually be worth it in the end.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that's my hope as well. I think like sometimes you see that too on the environmental side, like there's an effort to do like a holistic review of the whole region. And that takes a little bit of more time, but then it allows like individual projects to move a lot more quickly. So when you do your homework, I do think you can kind of speed up the process. Yeah, so I'd love to open the floor up to questions. Does anybody in the audience want to jump in on the bit? I can keep asking things, but I assume you have better questions than I do. Yeah, please go ahead. There's a microphone behind you that Mass is going to bring around.
Thanks very much to the panelists and to the organizers for this panel. Really insightful and very helpful introduction to this topic. My name is Alex Hanafi. I'm with Pollination, which is a climate and nature investment advisory firm. I'm a lawyer by training, and we give legal advice, but also advisory advice to companies, governments, nonprofits, foundations on where to invest to accelerate the climate transition. And my question, we often touch on community benefit sharing issues in projects. And so I wanted to ask first to Maria, your mention of that resource or these resources of community benefit agreements and community benefit plans, are those publicly available anywhere, or is there a place where people who want to find out more about those or learn from them could go? And I'm wondering if there's a network of communities that can share information. Are they learning from those and best practices? And then, did I do something for is this?
Get one question.
Okay. Yeah, they cut me off. That's it. Done. So that was one question. Sorry. The second one was, many of you were touching on these overlays of state, local, federal, right? And I'm wondering if you could just comment a little bit on, what are considering the different layers at which these activities take place and the coordination that comes from a state government versus incentives from the federal government versus action on the ground at the local level, is how much coordination is needed for these particular provisions to be successful? And what does that look like? Thanks.
Thank you so much for your question. I'm happy to take the first one on community benefit plans and agreements. And I might put someone in the audience that works at DOE and knows more about this on the spot. But yeah, so community benefit plans and agreements have been like a common practice, I think, at least in the last decade. And there is like a template of what they look like online. So the Department of Energy actually requires a community benefit plan to be submitted if you're gonna, for example, use like the Loan Program Office authority for like the Energy Infrastructure Reinvestment Act. So if you're going to apply for a special DOE program, sometimes they require you to actually have a community benefit plan agreement in place. So that's just like a name, but there is common templates that have been used that are published online. I don't know, my partner works at the Loan Program Office at Department of Energy and is published on this. Benji, if you want to talk about the resources that the Department of Energy has on it. Sorry.
Hi. Yeah, they're not currently published anywhere, but I think we're working on trying to get more details about those agreements published so people in the community in particular can know more about them and participate in them. But yeah, currently they're not, as far as I know, they're not published anywhere.
But there are like not like actual agreements are published, but there are templates that are. So happy to connect with you on the actual places where they are.
I could speak to the second question on intergovernmental coordination. One example of this in like my sphere of work on fossil fuel dependent communities is from federal interagency working group on coal and power plant communities. This is a interagency group that seeks to support coal-fired power plant communities and coal mining communities that are experiencing economic downturns as we move away from coal, which has been happening for decades, but it's been happening more quickly in recent years. And it's actually really, really challenging to integrate federal, state, tribal, local governments all working towards the same goals. There's actually a member of the interagency working group from EPA who's working with us at RFF this year, and he sort of helped us understand how challenging it's been. One thing that the IWG has done to try to do a better job at coordinating these different levels of government is establishing something called rapid response teams, which are essentially small bands of federal government employees who are sort of detailed to work specifically in one part of the country. So one in the Four Corners region, there's one in Wyoming, there's a couple in Appalachia, there's one in Southern Illinois. And what they do is they basically assemble resources and try to help local and state policymakers and other decision makers, as well as tribal decision makers, like, what is the federal grant opportunity that's well suited for this community? What is the federal grant opportunity that's not well suited for this community? What is the long-term economic development strategy that the federal government can help you develop over time? And that model of kind of embedding, if you will, people from the federal government in affected communities seems like a really promising one. It's very early days, so it's hard to say how it's all going to play out, but I think it's one model that's worth watching really closely.
If I can just add to that. So before coming to DOE, I actually worked launching state programs. So I've launched programs for a few state commissions. And then before that, I actually worked as a developer. So I kind of have the whole pipeline of experience. And what I would say is at this point, individual voices are extremely powerful. So an idea in one state that comes up in a docket with the PUC, a lot of times you'll see that opinion or like that idea replicated in other states. So right now is a time of building stakeholders just across the country through state programs that they're starting to kind of feed and grow on each other and evolve and adapt against each other. So it's really amazing. You'll see a lot of small municipalities making huge impact and huge waves on how programs are designed, not only in their local county, but also federally or in a sister state, or, so it's an incredible time to have a voice and be loud with it.
Great, thank you everybody for answering. I just wanted to chime in because I think, Daniel, you had to drop here maybe in a minute or two, and I didn't want to let you to do that without saying thank you and saying how much we appreciate your time and perspective on these issues. And so I encourage everybody to go check out Daniel's bio and publications. And I found out over the weekend that he has a podcast. So which for me is a lot more accessible than some of the reports. So anyway, thank you again, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you, John. It's really an honor to be. Oh, thank you. It's an honor to be among this great panel of experts, and I've learned a lot. So thanks very much. And the podcast is RFF's podcast, Resources for the Futures podcast. It's not mine. It's called Resources Radio, and you can find it anywhere you get your podcasts. Thanks again.
You can tell he's done it before. Yeah. I think we had maybe a question in the audience. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for this great panel. My name's Louise Dybel. I'm with Shepherd Mullen. I do environmental and energy law. And hi, I wanted to follow up just really quickly on the community benefit agreement question. In different kinds of contexts, I've worked on those. I just want to kind of shout out for their potential value. And also, one of the things that happens in the process of communications and developing the agreements is they get posted to a lot of city council agendas. So if you have a lot of time to look around on the web, you can find models and examples and build on those. Each one is unique and tailored. But I happen to have run into that problem myself. So, but my question really kind of comes back also to the interagency coordination question. I think that one of the things that's really interesting, valuable, and innovative about the IRA energy community programs is the fact that they really demand multiple agencies to kind of be involved in order to make them work. We have the EPA, we have Department of Energy represented here today, and we have the IRS, which is, from my perspective, maybe a little bit newer in this area. And like recently, they put up frequently asked questions about the brownfield credit and said that in order for mine-scarred lands, this is getting into the weeds here, but in order for mine-scarred lands to qualify as a brownfield site, they have to also qualify as a brownfield site based on the other criteria. So it's like redundant. And I see that and I think, well, we're going to fix that. But I also wonder if, you guys can comment upon how this process of getting these agencies to work together and communicate and just to make sure to smooth out those little hitches that come up when you're actually doing the implementation. And I guess it's mostly for Miana. I was hoping you can comment that a little bit.
Yeah, I can't really necessarily talk about it from, because I left the development life cycle before community benefits plans were a thing. But what I can talk about is where things get a bit sticky is when people aren't disclosing the truth of a project, right? And whether or not it's intentional. But a lot of times when I was kind of on the state side or on the developer side, there'll be commitments for workforce development, commitments of project financials, benefits to the community, that in actuality weren't really calculated, right? You might say you'll get X% off your power without actually looking at what power costs in that community, or the bill credits might not be published yet, or how is the community deriving its power already, right? And I've seen that locally in my own community, where if you actually signed up for something, you might actually have a higher cost for energy. So I think that's part one. Part two is really utilizing community-based organizations. So the organizations that are rooted where they are, you'll see food banks, you'll see economic organizations, local municipalities. They're incredible to work with. CDFIs, just the local members are the ones that are going to help you get your project out and running. But I think being upfront and honest about what your project is and what you don't know about the project yet is ultimately the most important part.
Which we have, David, did you have your hand raised a little earlier?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, David Lazarowitz with Farella, and I work principally on the utility scale side of it, but I've had a number of clients, and this is a very California specific question, but the community solar market is what I really wanted to talk about. And there's a lot of frustration in California. I mean, it's been extremely successful in states like New York and elsewhere. And I've had a couple of clients when AB 2316 passed that were extremely interested and literally on the ground in the state. And this gets to the issue for people more broadly about beyond siting, perhaps one of the most interesting or important issues is actually supply, right? Being able to aggregate people so that, they can actually access renewable power in a direct kind of electron way, as opposed to, largely being for people that are more affluent, can afford to put solar rooftop on. And there's just a lot of frustration, I know, and I hope somebody's familiar with. All right. Did that come back? Okay. With what's been happening, I know the PUC came out with its proposed rules, and it was largely utility focused. And there's just a lot of frustration in the state. Like, you know, that California hasn't been able to put together a community solar program. It's sort of the one state you think could do it. And it just seems to have failed at every turn. And I'm just curious if you guys could comment on, you know, the current state of community solar, particularly in California.
No.
I know I saw Miana shaking her head in agreement,
Yeah,
but okay.
yeah, I just didn't want to take up all the air. So I think California is in a bit of still a state of change. So there's a lot of like open calls for petitions. There's a lot of conversations going on from the large groups. You'll see, I think, CCSA, Coalition for Community Solar Access. You'll see SIA, you'll see these large groups there actively trying to change and create policies. The one thing I would say is a bit dangerous is comparing state to state programs. So I know a lot of people like to look at New York, which is a huge community solar market, and kind of replicate that across the states. That's not to say it doesn't have its problems. And what's really interesting about the state side is you can really create it for what your state needs, what the utilities there will amicably allow. So like you'll look at Excel, which sued one of the utilities for blocking community solar, or Excel Colorado, which sued and won. So you'll see kind of like state by state how these things are happening. Another one, New Mexico, that I happened to work on, it took 8 years to pass community solar legislation in New Mexico in particular. So I think it's always dangerous to try to just replicate what one state does and say it's a success, because it's not necessarily a success. In New York, the average savings now is only 5 to 10%, where other states, the average savings might be 20% for community solar. We don't necessarily want to replicate 5% savings across the country. So that's my only thing, but I will say keep an eye on California. I think it's still in motion to change. I think there's some incredibly intelligent voices out there that are driving change. And I think there's room for growth, right? And again, just I would argue, be that voice in the room if you feel comfortable as well.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, Mayanna's comment reminded me that Lawrence Berkeley National Lab just released a report on different rate designs as it relates to household solar, and which types of rate designs actually bring the most household savings benefits. As you mentioned, sometimes it's really small with like time of use rates, because that's not well aligned for when you're actually getting the solar. So just a resource to check out that our team has been utilizing as we're thinking about the rate design aspect as this news in California is coming.
Yeah, no, good, thank you. I might just, Madison, I'm having a little trouble finding questions in the chat. I see one, but if there are others that you want to highlight, that would be great. And just in terms of like scrolling, it's like a little bit hard to do on the screen. But I did have, I think, a question for you, Mayanna, about, is there a place we can sign up for notifications about when the applications are going to come live for 2024, or just in general, like to follow topics?
No, I did put in the chat for everyone. There is a landing page for this program that I would suggest bookmarking. I did also put in the Treasury press release on the program year 24 opening, where it states, this quarter. And I would suggest just checking back every week or so just to see where things are at. But we are in quarter 2. And the 2024 revenue procedure has been released, and it also includes the same thing as program year 23 with a 30-day initial application window. So, there is some time once it opens, if you're not immediately checking to get your application in.
That's great. Thank you. Tracy, there's a question that I'm going to kind of riff off a little bit, but in California, what are the sort of typical triggering mechanisms that will bring about like the actual public participation in terms of like, I think of the California Environmental Quality Act, but I know there are others, and you just kind of provide some of the context for when you have like public meetings and things like that on the projects?
Sure. So CEQA is probably a big one for any project, right? Which is where you weigh the environmental, you look at all the potential impacts to the environment. And that will have a series of ways to involve the community. And whoever asked this question, I'm going to tell you, if you're waiting for CEQA to do your outreach, you're waiting too long. So you really are, because you're behind the 8 ball, right? So I'm just thinking I work a lot with the regulatory agencies on environmental cleanups, and I've recently been working on battery energy storage facilities, which is a whole thing in California. But really, I would say that the EIR process is the one that's really going to get the public involved, but you need to involve people sooner than that if you want to involve them in any kind of substantive and meaningful way. I just keep saying that, right? I got one message.
I think it's an important message, right? And then I love, I can't call on two people at once, so I'm just going to pose a question and see if you're going to react to it. We'd love to maybe talk about some examples of like clean energy projects that have benefited environmental justice communities or communities of color. You all, like, anything that comes top of mind? Yeah. Diana, can you think of anything, or?
I mean, yes, but I can't necessarily, I think, talk about it because they're not my projects, right? So these are things you'll see developers advertise. You'll see really cool things. For example, there's the National Community Solar Partnership. They put out a ton of things and examples of great projects out there that are really focused on benefits. You're starting to see really creative projects that are community owned rather than owned by an asset owner or developer, which is incredibly cool. You're starting to see battery attached, which is really cool. There's some like innovative novel ideas out there. And that's also, to go back to my previous point, why you don't want to anchor on potentially an initial successful market, because there are some such cool ideas that now money is in the market for, and community solar and financiers are comfortable with, that you can be more creative, more innovative, and really focus on things like energy independence and resiliency. And if I had one point to kind of get out today, it's that this isn't as political as everyone thinks it is. Everyone wants good energy. Everyone wants stable energy. Everyone wants energy independence and reliance. And how you say it might change, right? What message is heard and delivered, as Tracy said, might change for what that community is interested in and what their motives and values are. But in the end, you know, everyone wants stable, good energy. So that's the thing I would get through. But there's some really cool creative things going through getting grants and small awards right now that are quite interesting and unique.
Yeah, I'm happy to add on one on that positive note that Diana shared. So RMI has a bright fields accelerator. So I know we were talking about brownfields before, and they're these like old factories or abandoned mines or landfills. And we're really trying to work with communities to try to repurpose a brownfield into a bright field. So hosting solar projects there. And we've identified that there's 63 gigawatts of solar capacity just at abandoned landfills. And one project that we're really excited that either just came online or is slated to come online this year is at this abandoned landfill in a historically Black community in Houston. And if I'm not mistaken, I think it'll be like a municipal or community-owned project. So really talking about that environmental justice opportunity, and that intersects with the energy community, since we know brownfields are where people just kind of dump stuff. So as we talk about getting creative, you know, repurposing those brownfield sites into solar projects is something that we're really excited about. And I think that's a 50 megawatt project in the community. So that's one that I wanted to shout out.
That's a great example. Is Brightfield, is that an RMI term? Or?
I don't know if it's like uppercase B, like we made our own proper noun there, but yeah, it's called the RMI Brightfields Accelerator. Yeah. I don't know if we took it from someone, but
It's good.
We popularized it, I'd say.
It's good. I mean, between that and clean and empowering, I think the marketing team at RMI is just it's very good. Sorry. It's an interesting question. So one of the questions we have in the chat is, how is the Department of Energy making sure that project companies are holding community readings or engaging with the public? And so I'm curious if are there any sort of public engagement processes baked in to these programs in the IRA? Maybe Mariana, if are there public comment opportunities, or how can people participate?
For how to see how it's been accounted for? Is that the question?
Yeah, it might be too
Yeah.
early for that too, or if there's just even kind of broader in thinking about like the rule makings, either from the IRS or just kind of broadly, how do we get the public involved?
Thanks for that. I would say it's still quite early, right? So programs are just providing money. They're just doing initial years. The program that I was speaking about earlier today, 48E, I mean, it launched, I think, as rapid as a program can launch, especially considering even in the private sector, to be honest, with the size of what the program is. So in terms of data analysis, measurements, things like that, I think that's to come in terms of what will be presented to the public. But I will say there's a lot of these programs have so many components, application process, different things they have to show along the way in the pipeline, that there's quite a bit to them, right? That people have to submit and be prepared to execute on.
I feel compelled to ask this question because I went to law school with Julian. And so he was wondering if there are mechanisms under the IRA that direct financial resources to interveners, like I in the public utilities context. So like in California, for example, like you have interveners who appear before the Public Utility Commission to the rate making proceedings or other rule makings. And so I guess are there resources in IRA that are directing funds to enable communities to participate more in their state kind of energy regulation? It's okay if you don't know either. It's sort of outside the scope, but I thought I'd ask you. Cool. All right, I'll take maybe one more from the chat, and then I do have a broader question for everybody to kind of wrap up. When we're looking at it, sort of, especially in fossil fuel communities facing, I think, economic losses from sort of those industries shutting down, kind of what are some strategies to like transition or avoid job losses and promote sort of kind of economic growth while we're engaging in the clean energy transition? Yeah, Maria, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think unions is kind of the first thing that comes to mind. And as we're thinking about a transition example, UAW, I think as they were, transitioning to, electric vehicle manufacturing and things like that, having that collective and bargaining power was just something that was really important, since they can kind of articulate what just transition means for them is, people that, cars, ICEs are fossil fuels, but now we kind of want them to do electric vehicles as well. So I think that's kind of just an important. Oh, I think it died. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, so going back to kind of, I think that's just an important element of that story, since I think there are industries like the auto industry that are kind of already reckoning with how to actually ask for things as they're seeing the transition happen right before their eyes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Kevin Wald again. Thank you very much.
Maybe Kevin, could you just pause 1 second while we get you on the microphone? Yeah, thank you.
Hi, my name is Kevin Waldhagen. Thank you very much for holding this panel. It's been very informative. This is exactly where I want to go with my own legal career. I talked hear a lot of people talk about transition and transitioning away from fossil fuels, and people have mentioned how some people have derived their income from fossil fuel production. How, either in terms of tribes who own land that happens to have fossil fuels, or just other landowners who have fossil fuels, how can one persuade them to, as opposed to developing their oil and gas resources, instead shift away from those and maybe focus on developing renewables instead? Like, how does the IRA sort of facilitate that process?
You want to talk about the clean repowering a little bit more, or I think it seems like you have the alley.
Yeah, so as I talked about the 250 gigawatt clean repowering opportunity that we found. So this is all clean energy potential that is within 40 kilometers of an existing fossil site that we know is economic in comparison to that fossil site, and also ensures that the same load is met, so reliability as well. So basically saying, let's ramp down this fossil production and use that point of interconnection to the grid to connect clean energy capacity. So as we just did 2 years of this analysis, and now we're going out to try to actually talk to developers and public utility commissions saying, what do we need to do to make this opportunity work? I think what you asked is right on the head, because we're gonna have to go to sites or places where there have been fossil sites already producing. So the way that we've talked about it is the economics are better. We know that solar and wind and batteries all is going to outcompete coal and natural gas at least 90% of the time. So talking about that access to clean energy and then reliability as well. All this clean energy potential, we know there's going to be as reliable as the fossil sources. So yeah, just trying to, as Mayanna said, just like reimagining this history and saying, it's not a fight about economics anymore, since we know cleaner energy is going to outcompete. So talking about that opportunity, but as well as saying there's a way to make this an economic development opportunity as well, and the health impact. So kind of like 4 punches from all directions to make that case. But as we've talked about, it's not just making that case, it's also listening and being informed by the local context as well, and especially in Indigenous communities where that history that I kind of started us off is really, really inequitable. So listen and then maybe make that case.
If I can jump in on that one a little bit. So I would also say, again, just being trustworthy. So a lot of times it's not that that communities don't want this, and specifically when thinking about this particular group, it's not that there's like a pushback, right? It's that financiers are nervous to go and develop under tribal jurisdiction, right? And they're scared to profit share, and they're scared to like build a new agreement that makes the best sense and most sense for people where they're trying to build. So a lot of times you'll see them rather build across the street on some farmer's land, right? So I would say going in and ensuring that you're creating the best benefit for the local people is what makes the most sense. And that changes wherever you go, right? Depending what they need. But that's where I saw a lot of the disconnect when I was on the state side of things, where developers would come in and promise that tribes could own the community solar field after 25 years. Well, you're promising they own garbage then, because that's just panels that don't work anymore. And those are not trustworthy deals. And that's what you're competing against when you're out in the market. So ensuring you level set and you're creating deals that are beneficial and are real, and creating trust instead of just, once again, exploiting.
Yeah, thank you. And sort of wrapping up at the end of the panel, and I have a question I want to steal from one of my favorite podcasts, What It Takes. Now, I always ask at the end, like, if you had a magic wand, what's one thing you would change? And so I'd love to, it can be kind of anything, but in terms of like spurring sort of the type of change that we're wanting to see in our communities, if you had a magic wand, what would you change? It could be a policy, it could be I know that might be tricky, so it doesn't have to be a policy. It could be something else if you want. But I just love to kind of go around and get your take on that. Anybody want to? Sorry to surprise you, but anybody want to start it out? Marie, yeah, Tracy.
Okay, I have a magic wand, and I would say to both of your points earlier, I would really encourage people to give up some of their power when they're working with communities. That's a really hard thing for people that have historically had power, right? But we work with, we have a collaborative model when we're working with communities. And part of that is that you're sitting at a table and you actually have to listen to lived experiences, hugely uncomfortable for people. It really is, but it really is a game changer for a lot of folks. And I really believe if we're going to change our climate crisis, then we're going to have to look at things and put value on other parts of life and not just capitalism. And that people are going, and I know, it's true, but I really think that's what's going to happen. And so, and I believe that if you really want to work with communities, you can come up with win-win solutions that not only do good, but they feel good. And you can leave a legacy that way. And that to me is a much better legacy than I made a whole bunch of money and got my project through. So I know that's a hard thing for people to hear. But I would say just from practicing public participation with people, it's a beautiful and humbling experience when you finally let go of your ego and realize people across from you have just as much to say as you do. So there it is.
That was perfect. Thank you.
Yeah,
Maria, yeah.
That's hard to follow because it was very inspiring. So I'm going to give a little bit of a wild card here. But as you mentioned, a lot of my work's on energy affordability, and in the US, 1 out of 3 families can't afford to pay their energy bills. And of course, there's your bills and your income part. So for bills, at RMI, we're always like, clean energy is going to bring your bills down. But we often don't talk about the income part. So magic wand for maybe more policies that can increase household income. So related to the minimum wage, things like that, just so that as we're talking about environmental justice communities, these are low wealth, low income communities with a lot of that are doing low wage work. So just trying to give people like the dignity that they have, and understanding that in 10 plus states, there's still people making $7.25 an hour. So just talking about dignity and making sure people can just afford to live as things are expensive. So sometimes we don't think about that part is in the energy world, but I think we kind of need to bring in economic justice to this field as well.
Great point. And sorry, Diana, to ask you to follow this to really
Yeah.
good answers, but you can wrap us up.
Yeah, those were incredible answers. I would say greenwashing. So, there's a lot of overstatement of what clean energy is, right? And a lot of tying it as like the magic bullet for so many different things. Clean energy isn't going to stop climate change. Using energy is inherently going to have some cause and effect, but clean energy does do some amazing and wonderful things, and taking away kind of the overstatements, the fluff, some organizations really overreaching in what they're promising, is really where I think the market could advance. And then on kind of the flip side of it, taking out the political side of it, we all want to live, as Maria said, we all deserve to live in our community of choice and as happy and as healthily as we can. And this can be one way to help that.
Well, thank you so much. And we're like very quickly approaching the end of our time. So I just want to get started on the thank yous right away. So thank you all for participating. The energy and sort of positivity was really appreciated. And I think, the passion you bring to the subjects, we need a lot of that. And I've heard sort of the climate is talked about as like, don't need just one really good idea, we need all of them. And so I just really appreciate the energy and the focus you're putting into the space. And thank you all folks for attending both in person and virtually. Our panelists' bios are kind of attached in the invite. So I encourage you to find them, follow what they're reading and writing about, and follow ELI and Farella for more great programming. But thank you everyone, and just really appreciate it.
Thank you.